Okay, so before I explain who that dancing guy was, let me just wrap up with the EU real quick. So yeah, there wasn't a European Parliament established in the early 2000s. I have to look up the exact date. It's not important for the class exactly, but there is a European Parliament established. The EU becomes more than just a common market in the 90s and moving into the 2000s with the advent of the new currency, of course, in 2002. Uh, I would see the EU as more like a loose confederation of states. At least I think that's kind of how it's envisioned. Generally speaking, you can move in between the borders of the EU. That's another part of the EU, so that makes them closer together. Now, each country reserves its own governments, so it's not like the United States functions today. And these are part of these. After 2004, you do have expansion of the EU, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And especially when there are economic crises, like in 2008, there's a lot of challenges because a lot of the countries are quite different, but they have integrated, to some extent, integrated economic systems. By the way, the United Kingdom, which was part of the European Union until 2020, kept its own currency, though. So that was an important thing that happened. While the United Kingdom did stay a member of the EU after 1993 and after 2002 until 2020, it kept its own currency, the British pound. So this map kind of shows us the expansion. The EU began really, well, Eastern Germany would not have been part of the EU originally. So it was West Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Italy. Okay, that was the original EU. Later, you can see these purple nations joined, right? And then their slow expansion. Now, these nations in the East don't join, as you can notice, until... So basically, the EU was mostly a Western European thing, right? Now, these nations begin joining the EU after 2004. That's when this expansion takes place towards the East. That's where some of the challenges come in. These former, that have been Soviet bloc countries, communist countries, but it's been a while since that had ended, right? And also, some of these were actually former Soviet republics, which made it even more controversial with the Russians over here, okay? So these are part of the former Soviet republics. This is also Belarus, a separate country now, former Soviet republic, and here's Ukraine here, okay? They are not part of the EU yet. There's debate about that still today, and we'll see what happens in the future, but this is a history class, not a future class. So now, going ahead to the guy we saw dancing there. Well, that man's name was Boris Yeltsin. That's him in the picture here. Believe it or not, he was the first president of Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was a coup by attempt of communist, strict communists in the Soviet Union and military officials who wanted to stop Gorbachev's reform movement. And they saw what was happening. Once the Soviet bloc countries broke away from the Warsaw Pact, former Soviet republics who were not Russia wanted to start breaking away. And this first started in those Baltic states, the ones that Stalin had gobbled up after World War II and brought into the Soviet Union. Also, so what starts happening is these Baltic states begin to basically, they want to leave the Soviet Union altogether. You'll see similar things, and I'll have a map to show you this, with the Asian Soviet republics. I call them the stands, but you'll see what I'm talking about. So there was this coup to try to stop Gorbachev's reform. It failed. And one of the reasons why it failed is this, a lot of the military wasn't going to enforce the coup. Now, I've seen different dates on this, but essentially the Soviet Union ended around Christmas time, 1991. Some people extend it to early January 1992, but at this time, we can say the the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics dissolved as a political entity. And what was going to replace it, right? That's the question. What were these various republics going to become? They did try to create something called the Commonwealth of Independent States. I don't think this is around in the same way at all anymore. It was supposed to be essentially the old republics who wanted to join with Russia in this Commonwealth of Independent States. It was not very, it wasn't a, I don't think it was an adequate replacement for the Soviet Union in most people's minds, but that's what happened. The guy in the picture there, and the dancing guy we saw, was Boris Yeltsin. Now, Boris Yeltsin, like anybody in history, he could probably be seen as doing a lot of good things and a bit of some not so good things. One, it seems that he did like to imbibe vodka quite a bit and other forms of alcohol. But, he's not the only man to do that. But he's genuinely a hero in some ways, at least from some people's perspective, because it is he who was a political leader in Russia who stood up to this coup in 1991. And he will also be elected the first president of Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union and will remain president throughout the 1990s. Now, his remaining president throughout the 1990s, and I think he was reelected in 1996, and what happens in Russia in the 90s is some of the bad stuff that's associated with him, and I'll mention some of those things. And that's what I'm getting to in the next point there. There was, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had the collapse of systems that had been around for a long time. There was a lot of people coming into Russia and these other places from outside to try to make money. And frankly, there was quite a bit of exploitation that went on, I would say, by people that were called businessmen and some women, obviously. We could call them, they began being known as the oligarchs. And Russia did not do well economically in the 1990s. There was a lot of corruption. Over time, there was a centralization of power, but that really didn't take place completely until the 2000s, under the next president we're going to be talking about here. But Boris Yeltsin came to be seen as associated with all this economic corruption and, frankly, a lot of corruption in government. But here is Yeltsin rallying against the coup that I just mentioned in 1991. And he's waving there the flag, the Russian flag. That's not the flag of the Soviet Union. That flag goes back to Peter the Great from the early 1700s. So that shows you something, that he this is how he made his mark, and this is why he ends up as first elected president after the end of the Soviet Union. He also, however, had his struggles within his own party at the time. In 1993, for instance, Yeltsin sent the military in to attack the Russian parliament, which he believed was trying to commit a coup against him at the time. So, now let's look at Russia. I was talking about the different places. So, this is a map of Russia today. These were all former Soviet republics, okay? So when I talk about the Baltic states, these are the ones I'm talking about. Belorussia and Ukraine were also Soviet republics, okay? So these become independent. Here are the stands I was talking about. So all these stands, the 5 stands here, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, had all been part of the Soviet Union too. No longer. Also, there was an Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia were all Soviet republics. They all become independent also. This area, I'm going to mention this in a minute, is an area that remains part of Russia, but there's a lot of resistance to Russia, especially by certain Muslim groups there. And that's known as Chechnya. And there's a war here that goes on throughout the 90s and into the early 2000s. Russia has its own Islamic terrorism issues, and a lot of that's actually related to groups down here in Chechnya. Okay. Now, Vladimir Putin came to the office of the presidency through a deal with the clique, with the group that surrounded Yeltsin in 1999. Yeltsin resigned. I actually think it was like on New Year's Eve. New Year's Eve. I've watched a video about this, and read about it. But they picked Putin. This group picked Putin, who was a fairly obscure official in St. Petersburg, and they picked him because I think they thought they could control him. But it turns out it would be the other way around ultimately. Putin was a former KGB man. So the KGB is kind of similar to very similar to the American CIA. Even more so, a security force in Russia too. It wasn't just a outside intelligence force. So he was an educated guy. He had spent time in Western Europe as a young man in the KGB. We know he speaks German fluently, probably speaks English pretty well too. But he manages to become president in 2000 after Yeltsin resigns. And then he's elected president again, and he remains president until 2008. Now, Vladimir Putin is currently president of Russia, but I'm going to kind of stop before 2010 here for our class. As I was talking about, that area in southern Russia, near Georgia and Azerbaijan there, in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, was a big problem for the Russians in the 90s. This group known in Chechnya, there's a lot of Muslims there. There's also nationalism involved in this, but there was quite a bit of Islamic terrorism. Some of those were supported by groups similar to what would become Al-Qaeda and other groups, okay, like that, jihadi groups. And there was a big terrorist attack, and a number of big terrorist attacks in Russia in the late 90s and into the 2000s. Related to this. Under Putin, there has been a great centralization of power. Also, another thing Putin did that has made him quite popular, that made him quite popular in Russia, was to start arresting many of those oligarchs, and he portrayed them as basically exploiting the people, exploiting Russia, and to a great extent, he wasn't wrong about that. Now, he probably made himself more powerful and probably quite a bit more wealthy himself. So I don't want to get into all those issues. We don't have time, but you can read about that if you're interested. There are definitely different views on it. But Vladimir Putin is generally seen, at least by Russians, for the most part, as being a capable and strong leader who helped Russia advance and recover from the problems, from the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the problems that came about in the 1990s. Now, a lot of these conflicts in the early 2000s, especially after the war on terror starts, I'm going to mention, we'll be talking about that a little bit in another video on the Middle East. Russia sought some cooperation both with NATO and the U.S. But as NATO expanded eastward, Russia, whether rightly or wrongly, and in their mind very rightly based on history, began to see NATO's expansion as an aggressor against them. Okay? And so by 2008, Putin and the Russian government and most Russians come to see NATO and the U.S. as an aggressor towards them. And this has set much of the policy of conflict, semi-conflict, since that time. Thank you.